do keep introducing yourself. And welcome to this training around, grassroots campaigning in a general election and what that means for us. So just to introduce what we're going to cover in this training and also what we're not going to cover. I'm hoping to sort of give you a bit of an overview of some key definitions and some of the restrictions on campaigning that apply to any organisation when we're in a general election period. This is just sort of going to be very common sense advice, skill sharing as much as possible, drawing out your plans and ideas as well for how to continue engaging in your usual campaigning activities as best as possible in light of the restrictions. And it's a chance to ask questions and just think together about the support needs that grassroots groups and organisations in particular might have in the run up to a general election, because tipping point, for those of you that sort of don't know exactly what we do, that's sort of what we're here to do, is basically find out what needs there are within the grassroots movement and as much as possible sort of provide trainings, resources and capacity to help support and sort of fill those gaps. So it's good to see lots of folks here with a bit of an interest in this. We'll be doing a series of trainings that relate to the election and covering different things that people sort of ask for over the coming months. What this training isn't, I guess I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want you to take this as formal legal advice, and it's definitely not an exhaustive list of do's and don'ts. I've drawn a lot of the sort of legal terminology and definitions from some briefings put together by very good lawyers called Bates Wells, and that there's some references and links to all of those source materials at the end of the presentation, which we'll send out as well. But yeah, I'm not here to kind of scare you off or like dissuade you from doing anything political in a key election year. That's definitely not the intention. It's about sort of getting as informed as we can and figuring out together like how best to keep doing what we're doing in the most powerful way possible. So I hope that sounds good to everyone, and we'll dig in. So a general election is definitely coming. We know that much. It has to happen by the 28th of January 2025 at the latest. But the big sort of question everyone is obviously taking punts on is, when will that be? It's up to Rishi Sunak to call it. I'm keen to get a bit of a sweepstakes going in the chat about what most people, the majority of people, think in terms of timing. Are we, there's still maybe some people thinking it might come as early as May, but maybe not. I think the smart money, certainly if you look at what the bookies are saying, is sort of 1 in 3 chance of an autumn election, probably November, mid-November we're looking at. But yeah, there's obviously lots of considerations for the government and the Prime Minister in deciding that, not least sort of their position in the polls, the fact that it's a US general election, I think it's the 5th of November as well, and weighing up staying in power as long as possible versus like the most opportunistic moment, but also to do with the weather and how dark it gets over the into December. Most people think it's fairly unlikely. Some people saying hearing rumors of June, November. Yeah, today was the last chance to announce for May. So yeah, I think over the weekend it was pretty much confirmed by Rishi Sunak they're not going for a May election. But the reason the Parliament Act basically makes it a requirement that by the 28th of January 2025, is the last, well, that will automatically be like the trigger an election. So just to sort of run through that timeline between now and then. Essentially, the PM decides, Rishi Sunak, assuming he's still the PM, will decide on the exact date. And once they've decided a date, we'll sort of announce that and ask the King to dissolve Parliament, declare the date for the preferred election. It could be called early, in which case there's notice given before Parliament is dissolved, or it could be triggered automatically by that 28th of January date. But essentially, when Parliament's dissolved, like that means all business in the House of Commons is stopped, all MPs lose their seats, and we enter what's known as like the short campaign. So that's the 25 working days before the general election happens. And then, so that's a 6-weekish period leading up to the election, between that dissolution of Parliament and the general election, which usually is held on a Thursday. So if you're all thinking, around October, November, it's going to be one of those sort of Thursdays in those months. If the PM doesn't call an election before the 17th of December, then that will automatically trigger the dissolution of Parliament, and we'd have an election on the 23rd of January at the latest, because that's the Thursday before that deadline. So that's just a little bit about timing, just to set us in context. I don't know if there's any questions so far around any of those basics. Otherwise, I will continue. So I guess, yeah, a general election year isn't like every other year for campaigners. There's a reason we're all here discussing this. I guess for many groups and organisations, it's, elections are a chance to push forward our agenda, to build relationships with future MPs, ministers, parties of government. And that's obviously really important, not just for sort of big NGOs and charities, but for grassroots organisations and grassroots groups seeking to, get our issues out there, get pledges of support from candidates, on issues that we're working on. But whilst it is a period of opportunity, it's also, carries some risk and opportunity, like need for legal compliance. So there's some considerations that we're going to go into. There are restrictions on what candidates, parties and non-parties can do in the full 12 months or 365 days before a general election. And so I'm going to go through some of these now. It's worth noting from that timeline that I showed that we're already in that period, and the rules do already apply to us, because obviously we are after the 28th of January 2024. I think before we dig into this, I do want to highlight, there's nothing wrong with undertaking political activity in that 12-month period. It's just good to be aware of those restrictions and whether or not they apply to us, and how we go about things. So going to talk through, first of all, a little bit about some key definitions. One of the key restrictions is around spending, which may or may not apply to grassroots groups, because a lot of us just are volunteers without budgets. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's possible in terms of electoral materials and imprints, and then we'll talk a little bit about what does this all mean for us. So who can do what under electoral law? I'm focusing today just on non-parties, because that's what we are, but there are sort of different rules for what candidates can do, what parties can do, and then non-party campaigners is essentially any organisation and individual that campaigns or is seen to be campaigning ahead of an election, but not standing themselves. So if you're seen to be sort of engaging in campaigning, you will be subject to the regulations that we're going to go through. So that's financial limits basically on the regulated sort of activity that you can do in the 12 months before an election. And you'll be subject to sort of needing to register if you go beyond those limits. So grassroots groups, I guess, are often counted as unincorporated associations, but they can fall under this definition of non-party campaigners. And we'll get to those requirements, like compliance requirements, in a minute. But I guess, first of all, question to you all, like, what do you think counts as general campaigning? So any organisation of individuals that campaign or are seen to campaign for an election, what do you think falls under that definition? I'd love to hear what yeah, just shout in the chat if you want to share kind of what you think. I'll just give you a minute to have a think about that, have a stab at a definition or activities that you think would fall under that. So yeah, putting out communications relating to political parties and who to vote for. Yeah. And Cara says if you call for support for a particular party, exactly. Maybe even anything to do with voting at all, as Dom, i.e. telling people that you should all vote. Well, we'll have a look at the actual definition and see whether that does stand true. So let me just go to this slide. So this is this is taken from a legal briefing by Bates Wells and Neon, who've put this together. So this is often called the purpose test. So what counts as regulated activity or what counts as campaigning. And it's activities that are accessible to the public. That's really important. So I've underlined that, which can reasonably be regarded as intended to promote or procure electoral success at any relevant election for the following things. So either one or more particular political parties, one or more political parties which advocate or do not advocate particular policies or otherwise fall within a particular category of parties, or candidates who hold or do not hold particular opinions or who advocate or don't advocate for particular policies, or who otherwise fall within a particular category of candidates. So that's covers quite a lot of things. It's not necessary to name a party or a type of candidate in your campaigning materials. Your materials could meet the purpose test if it's positive or negative about a policy that's closely connected to a particular party. So, for example, expanding new oil and gas. Let's just choose that example, which is a fairly general one. But yeah, the more specific you get, the more likely you are to fall within that category. But so yeah, if you're being positive or negative about a policy that's closely connected with one party or another in such a way that basically any reasonable person might think you're calling for the public to vote for or against that party, then you would be subject to that purpose test. There are some exceptions, but basically most everyday campaigning techniques, associated expenses will be caught if they meet this test. And yeah, it's sort of fairly broad. The only sort of caveat is like the accessible to the public bit, and that's important. So I think I've got a slide on this coming in a little bit, but basically you, as a grassroots group, might have a mailing list of supporters. They would count as your committed supporters. You can say what you want to the people that have asked you to tell them what you think. But if you're putting anything out publicly that could be reasonably accessed by the public, then that would fall basically and meet this purpose test and count as regulated activity. So just to make that a little bit clearer, I'm going to set you a little bit of an exercise now. I'm not sure how many people we are, about 20. So I'm going to ask Rona to just quickly pop people into breakout groups. And, oh, no, I don't want to give you the answers. Hang on, go back a slide. And I've got a few different examples here of things that, you might, let's say you're a campaigning group, you might want to do these things. Do they or don't they count as general campaigning and under that sort of regulated activity? And I just want you to have a quick 5-minute chat in your with whoever you end up with in a little breakout group, discussing each of these and where you might put them. Just draw yourself a yes or no box. I'll keep the slide up so that you can still see it when you're in your groups. But just to run through these quickly, a website comparing MPs' climate voting records, where would you put that? An email laying out what candidates have said about Gaza, or a sticker that says vote for no new oil, a poster that says I won't vote for Tories, a tweet calling Rishi Sunak a liar, or what's my last one? I need to move my window. A tweet that says, that's thanking your MP for signing a pledge on your campaign, for example. So is that clear as an activity? Rona, are you okay to launch some groups and we'll come back together in, say, 5 minutes or so? Just have a quick chat about that and where you would put those and what you'd need to consider.
Recording in progress.
Thank you, Rona. So yeah, committed supporters. Basically, if people have signed up to receive information from you, I've said this already, so say they've joined your mailing list, they don't count as the public. So they're not, it's not counted as influencing the general public or a portion of the public, which is the test for the purpose test. And I guess an example of that would be if you're putting a Facebook post out saying, whatever, I can't think of an example, but something that would meet that purpose test. It's important to remember that anything that you post on social media, unless it's in a closed group like Facebook group, or as you were saying, Bryce, a closed signal group or something like that, is going to count as public. So only if people have explicitly signed up to give you their information, to contact them directly, it wouldn't count. It's worth saying, if you don't have a mailing list, it's really important to have one for precisely this reason. And Tipping Point can offer, free tools from our tech hub if you don't already have this set up, like a mailing list or a petition tool to collect sign-ups from people in your local area, or whatever. Maybe Rona, you could pop in the chat the tippingpointuk.org tech hyperlink so that anyone who wants to find out more about that can. But yeah, that's one of the reasons why I guess it's really important to be growing your direct reach as a group, is that there are some restrictions on what you can say in public versus what you can say to people who want to hear from you. Just check the chat. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'll move on to the spending limits. Um, Again, I want to re-emphasize it's not unlawful to do any of the things that we just talked about. It's just that the amount that you can spend doing them is regulated. And um, yeah, if you want to go over those spending limits, you can still do that. It's just that you have to register with the Electoral Commission. So does anyone know the spending limits? Like what you can spend on regulated activity before you have to be registered with the Electoral Commission? Any answers on a postcard in the chat? I guess there's a reason we're all here in this training is to find out. So the answer is, oh, someone's, Anthony's guessed 100K. No, that's quite a lot of money, which I'm assuming most grassroots groups don't have access to. I know we certainly don't. It's a good guess, but the limit is actually quite low. If you're a group that is funded, it's well, no, sorry, I don't want to confuse things. This spending limit applies to any non-parties. Okay, so whether you're a big NGO charity that has lots of funding or whether you're a grassroots group, 10K is the amount you can spend as a maximum before being registered. And it has to be, so this is the limit that applies if you have a sufficient UK connection. So basically any sort of local group in the UK would fall within that definition. You can spend more than that, but you have to register with the Electoral Commission to spend more than that. If you're a non-UK group, so like an international group that's wanting to say something, during the election, you can do that, but you're only allowed to spend £700. That's the limit. And it's important to say that a coalition of groups working together, so the definition is like groups with a common plan or arrangement, count towards that spending limit jointly. So I'm aware that, for most sort of unfunded, unincorporated groups, £10,000 is an awful lot of money. You're not that likely to be spending that. But if you were working as part of a national coalition of groups with a joint plan, you might individually, 20 groups spend £500 each on printing some stickers. That would add up to £10,000 and still count, right? So that's important to know. The other thing to say is the biggest sort of, when you think about spending, they're not just referring to, the bill for printing lots of stickers. It also counts, it's like anything that can be valued. So if you have paid staff or paid organisers, you'd need to value and like count that towards the limit. So the amount of time spent, doing whatever, whether that's tweeting or distributing posters or designing stuff or organising a hustings event or whatever it might be. But obviously volunteer time is free, and one of the biggest resources that grassroots have is the capacity that volunteers put in, and that obviously doesn't have any sort of value in terms of a spending limit. So useful to think about that. There's a slightly different limit when it comes to constituencies. So each constituency, so this is where you're doing something that would count as regulated activity, but just with the aim or perceived aim of getting one specific candidate elected in a constituency. That limit is £700 that you can spend in the short campaign. So again, remembering that the short campaign is that 6-week period between when the election's been called and when it happens. That's £700 total, or 17,500 per constituency in the year leading up to that election. So again, probably no one here is likely to be thinking about spending that amount of money, but that's uh, the sort of limit on a sort of localized election basis. Yeah, Anthony, go ahead. Um, oh yeah, one important note is that ongoing campaigns are unlikely to pass the purpose test and actually be seen as intended to influence the outcome of the election. So if you have started a campaign before the regulated period and you're just carrying on with your campaign as normal without doing any of the sort of specific candidate or party stuff that we just talked about, then that's kind of fine. And maybe one other thing to note, which is important, I should have put a bullet point on this, but in terms of the short campaign and that spending limit, that's actually not very much if you're thinking about printing like, thousands of stickers or whatever. What you can't do is print leaflets or stickers before the short period and then use them in the period without counting that spending towards the limit. So just something to bear in mind. That limit will always, it's about sort of whether they're being used in that period. However, I guess if you wanted to print a load of stuff and get it out before the short period, it wouldn't count in a constituency towards that limit. So just, again, I'm not offering any legal advice. I'm just saying kind of what is and isn't possible within the law. So I was asking, is there a limit beyond the short campaign period? Do you mean for constituency spending?
Probably like, yeah, for that.
Yes.
Because the other rule doesn't relate to the short campaign period. It's just said from when it's announced.
No, sorry. Just to clarify, the main spending limit is the 12 months. So it's not connected to the short campaign. So we are in that regulated period now and have been since the 25th of or 28th of January. Okay, there's a couple more slides that I have, but I just want to check whether there's more questions. Okay, just because we've only got a few minutes left, I'll just touch on the final points, but I do want to say we'll be doing many more sort of trainings and sessions on this. This is just a sort of taster session. So just around election materials, like if you do want to create stuff specifically as a group to put out your position, to try and influence people in your area, you are required under electoral law to put what's called an imprint on materials. So that's a statement that's setting out transparently who's putting out the content. And yeah, since November, that's basically been a requirement on digital campaigning materials as well, including audio content. So say you're doing an interview podcast type thing that's all about like why you shouldn't vote for XYZ person, or why parties that want to push new oil and gas shouldn't stay in power. Like you would need to say, this podcast has been paid for by blah, blah, blah. But yeah, again, it only applies if the material can be seen as intended to influence an electoral event. I gave before that example of Chris Packham's posters. You're sort of on the website where you can go to download those posters. I'm not saying you should, but the link is there. I think it says like this, I can't remember the exact statement, but it's promoted by Chris Packham, the website itself. The posters themselves, like people are printing off and putting up in their windows as and where they want to, and that's fine. Okay, very quickly to wrap up, just some other things to keep in mind. GDPR, always important. Only email and text individuals who've actually consented being contacted that way. I guess, just in an election period, you want to just be sure to be doing things the right way. So also in creating graphics, important to consider intellectual property, only use images, video that you've got the rights to use. False statements. So don't share anything untrue or defamatory about a candidate's character or conduct. It can get quite heated, especially in the context that we're living in at the moment. But yeah, stick with facts. You might be liable to defamation if you say something that you can't back up with evidence, and it could be a criminal offence. So just better to avoid any any chance of that happening. Just be polite, be kind, be truthful. But many of our rights are being eroded around protests, but we do still have the right to free speech, to hold opinions, express them freely, both, still to this day through protest for now, and to publish them without government interference. So again, I don't want the takeaway message from this to be like, don't say the things that are really important to you to say on the issues that you care about during this election. It's a really pivotal moment to kind of get our voices out there and yeah, make as much impact as we can. It's just knowledge is power. It's important to know what could get you in trouble and what couldn't. Okay. There's obviously lots of different tactics and things. We've talked a lot about printed materials, kind of public communications, but there's lots of other things that grassroots groups are considering and thinking about and doing on a regular basis as part of their ongoing campaigning, which may or may not play into what you're thinking about doing around the election. We have run out of time. I was going to sort of have a bit of a discussion to find out a little bit more about people's plans, and but we're going to have to leave that for the next session. What we'll be doing is sending out these slides, and within those there's a list of some of the sources for this information. But as a final sort of recap, I am aware people need to get off and go and have their lunch or whatever, but do keep campaigning, keep recruiting supporters onto your mailing lists, signal groups, whatever, because then you can, communicate directly with people without falling foul of any of this stuff. Do encourage people to vote, and do keep track of costs and receipts where you are spending stuff. Keep working with other groups together on this and talking about what you might be able to do together, but just don't exceed £10,000 in a year, and don't spend more than £700 during the short campaign in your constituency, and you should be fine. But as I say, there's lots and lots more support and information available around this, particularly I've mentioned Bates Wells, but Neon also has several trainings and a help desk, and yeah, there's various other links there. And then the final thing to say is that Tipping Point runs trainings sometimes 2-3 times a week. Do check out the calendar for the next trainings that we'll be holding around election stuff. If you want to go into more depth, we'll be doing some deep dives. This was just a sort of basic introductory one. So I hope that was really helpful for people. Sorry if I didn't get to answer all the questions, but thank you so much for joining us, and yeah, hopefully see you at future trainings, and have a good day, everyone. Thanks a lot.